Good afternoon. My name is Bob Amio, and I'm co-chair of the Hastings College Lecture Series Committee. The introduction I'm about to read to you was actually written by Dr. Tricia Oman, who was supposed to be here to introduce Dr. Reeds, but she's unable to be here, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it word for word because it is beautifully written and exactly states things as I would. So, but due credit to Dr. Oman. It's hard to believe that Dr. Reeds started at Hastings College only 3 years ago. In that short time, she's become a vital part of HC life, as evidenced by this honor, the Invited Faculty Lecture. The Invited Faculty Lectures began in 1967 and are the highest and longest standing faculty honor at Hastings College. Each year, 2 faculty are elected through a joint faculty and student vote. The honorees then deliver lectures on topics of their choosing to the campus community. I'm delighted to introduce the first of this year's honorees, Dr. Eleanor Reeds, who will be giving a talk entitled Uncovering a Queer Tongue in Dracula. Singing Dr. Reeds' praises is no easy task. She's pretty amazing. I won't be able to tell you about all her accomplishments in just a few minutes. I could mention her degrees, such as a PhD in English from the University of Connecticut and a BA in English from Cambridge University, but instead I'll focus on a few highlights from her time here at Hastings College. As many of you know, Dr. Reeds teaches English and writing courses in the Department of Languages and Literatures. Although her specialty is 18th and 19th century British literature, she has a wide range of interests and teaches a wide range of courses, including young adult literature, LGBTQIA literature, sports literature, and creative writing. Currently, she can be seen in McCormick Hall in such courses as Literature of Madness and Academic Writing. You may not know, however, that Dr. Reeds is also a writer. As a scholar, she has published in many academic journals, including Victorian Poetry, American Literary Realism, and the children's journal, The Lion and the Unicorn. But not content to just study literature, Dr. Reeds also writes literature, having published poems in magazines such as Plain Songs and Aurora Journal. In her spare time, Dr. Reeds serves on a number of faculty committees, including the Curriculum Committee, the Individualized Program Committee, and the Continuous Improvement Committee, committees that have very buzzword-sounding names but actually are very important for the development of curriculum at the college. Despite these impressive professional accomplishments, however, many of us in this room know that Dr. Reeds' biggest talent is building relationships. She's not just a teacher, she's a mentor. She's not just a colleague, she's a friend. She's not just a sympathetic ear, she's an ally. I've been looking forward to this talk because Dracula, but also I'm very happy to celebrate my colleague and friend, Dr. Eleanor Reeds.
Thank you, Dr. Amio and Dr. Oman, for those very kind words to introduce me this afternoon. And thank you all so much for being here. It's been hard to avoid developing a crush on a fictional vampire if you've read a young adult novel, watched a CW show, or been to a movie theater in the last 20 years. If Twilight's Edward Cullen was a little too noble for you, there was always the Vampire Diaries bad boy, Damon Salvatore. And my own tastes have certainly evolved since high school and college. After all, if a tenured professor at Yale can create a character like Matthew Claremont, surely it's not too inappropriate for me to swoon as recently as this summer at his portrayal by Matthew Good in the television adaptation. There's been something sexy about vampires since they became popular characters in fiction around 200 years ago. For instance, one important early text in establishing the genre of the vampire romance was John William Polidori's The Vampire, A Tale. This short work of prose fiction was written in response to the same challenge to write a ghost story that led Mary Shelley to begin composing Frankenstein in 1816. Polidori was a doctor, and his seductive vampire, Lord Ruthven, was based on his most famous client, the mad, bad, and dangerous to know Lord Byron, who had to leave England after scandalous and probably accurate rumors began circulating that his marriage had ended because of adultery, incest, and sodomy. Half a century later, in 1872, the Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu created the iconic Carmilla, a vampire whose interest in the young female narrator is often romantic, and who has thus been identified as the forerunner of the 20th century trope of the lesbian vampire. So, while modern authors such as Stephanie Meyer might have popularized a heterosexual version of the romance between a human and a vampire, I'm here to break it to all of you that the vampires of 19th century fiction were usually queer. Let me define one of my key terms here before we move on. Queer has meant peculiar or odd since it was first used in the 1500s, and it became associated with homosexuality at the beginning of the 20th century, becoming a slang term that was sometimes a derogatory slur. When the gay pride movement really took off in the 80s and 90s, however, queer was reclaimed and became an umbrella term for those who do not identify as heterosexual or cisgender. Queer is used very widely in academic contexts. We talk about queer theory and queer studies to highlight the work of scholars and critics who are interested in how LGBTQ perspectives, experiences, and communities can challenge what we believe to be normal or natural. Today, I want to explore with you all how the most famous vampire of all, Count Dracula, can be understood as queer. First, by looking at how literary critics have examined issues of gender and sexuality in Bram Stoker's original novel, published in 1897, and then by introducing a very recent reimagining of Dracula by the transgender poet Chase Bergren. If you haven't read Dracula recently, or your memory is clouded by the many film adaptations that stray wildly from the source material, luckily, I have a class of students who just did, and have helpfully provided their own interpretive summaries of the novel. So what really happens in Dracula? Forget glitter and rock-hard abs. Vampires are back, and nowhere near as sexy as you've been led to believe. Dracula, beyond being an early attempt by Bram Stoker at self-insert vampire fanfiction, represents a perversion of expectations and contradicts what nearly a century of media adaptations have established as one of the most popular monsters of all time. The novel Dracula is not actually about the blood-sucking vampire, but instead focuses on a group of people fighting rationality, societal norms, and the threat of madness to save their lives and souls. At the center of it all are a woman and a madman who hold the pieces to understanding and defeating the final evil reality that is Count Dracula. The novel begins as solicitor Jonathan Harker is invited to Castle Dracula by the Count himself. Peculiar events and people surround him there, and he begins to question his sanity regarding everything he knows. Jonathan sneaks around the castle, overcome by curiosity, and ends up finding Count Dracula exhibiting some very strange, almost inhuman behaviors. Jonathan makes sure to note down all these happenings in his journal before he is attacked by Dracula and 3 of his henchwomen. Meanwhile, Jonathan's fiancée, Mina, and her dear friend Lucy are gossiping through their letters about the 3 proposals Lucy has just received. One of her disappointed suitors is Dr. Seward, the director of an asylum, who exhibits questionable actions in regard to a current patient of his, Renfield, who has been eating insects, expecting they will allow him to live longer. Renfield also has an ominous and unexplained connection to Dracula. Mina becomes worried about the absent Jonathan, and Lucy's luck begins to take a turn for the worse, starting with several strange sleepwalking episodes. So Dr. Seward calls in Van Helsing to help with Lucy's care. All of their efforts, including a series of blood transfusions from Lucy's admirers, end up being for nothing, because Lucy eventually dies after being turned into a vampire. Her own fiancé, Arthur Holmwood, has to stake her down. The four stooges, Jonathan, Seward, Arthur, and Quincy, then plot with Van Helsing to find the last box filled with sacred dirt in order to kill the OG vampire. Dracula ends up forcing Mina to drink his blood, and with her entranced, Van Helsing is able to hypnotize her to learn the whereabouts of Dracula. The crew tracks him down and puts an end to all of the madness, saving the soul of Mina, the girl boss who organized everyone's notes and connected all the dots to ensure victory, while the men could barely continue without one of them fainting away. In the process, the four stooges become three, but in the end, all is well. As you might imagine from that brief review of the novel, Dracula has been a rich source of insight for scholars interested in gender and sexuality over its long reception history. For example, literary critics interested and influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis were keen to point out that scenes such as Arthur staking his dead fiancée Lucy after candle wax made of sperm, as in the whale oil, is spilled on her coffin, are obvious examples of a both sexual and violent dynamic in the novel, in which the vampire woman who wants to drain a man's life-giving fluid needs to be destroyed. Feminist critics in the 60s and 70s also noted this hostility toward female sexuality, and often explored how Lucy and Mina represented the binary of the sensual and the sexless woman, the whore and the virgin, respectively. In the 80s and 90s, scholars then deepened our understanding of how Stoker's novel inverts and troubles the gender identity of many characters. For instance, Christopher Kraft famously described the vampire mouth as fusing and therefore confusing the gender-based categories of the penetrating and the receptive, as the phallic teeth are inserted into a victim's body in order to then drink their blood in an act mimicking fellatio. Considering Stoker began writing the novel only a month after Oscar Wilde had been on trial for gross indecency, expert readers of Dracula have also examined how homoeroticism is still detectable because, and not despite, of its displacement and repression in the text. Particular attention has been paid to the opening chapters, in which the monstrously depicted Dracula imprisons Jonathan Harker and even wears his clothes, as well as to how this vampire ultimately uses different female surrogates, both vampires and their victims, to fulfill his desire to possess and feed on the young solicitor. My own current research builds on this already substantial exploration of gender and sexuality in Bram Stoker's Dracula by examining a very recent reimagining of the novel by the transgender poet Chase Berggren. Dedicated to survivors of rape, sexual abuse, and domestic violence, Red was published in 2018 as a sequence of lyric poems narrated by a woman subjected to the horrors of patriarchal marriage, who ultimately seeks revenge on her husband. As Berggren explains in their introductory note on process, the collection was composed during the author's gender transition, as they were discovering and attempting to define their own womanhood. Red is an erasure of the 27 chapters of Dracula, which means that Berggren created each poem by whiting out a copy of the novel, using Stoker's own words in the original order to draft the collection. Erasure is a common way for authors to reimagine and wrestle with existing texts, often in order to discover what was erased, illegible, or silent in the original, especially when the source text was created by those with power and privilege. For example, M. Norbsy Philip used erasure to discover the voices, stories, and experiences of Africans that were murdered on the slave ship Zong by working only with the words of a legal case about their enslaver's insurance claim. Originally, Chase Bergeron tried to reimagine Dracula by attempting to write poems in the voices of existing characters, including Dracula, Mina, and Lucy. But they ultimately decided to physically engage with the text through erasure, to alter and to appropriate the novel in order to challenge Stoker's narrative by wrestling with his own language. My claim is that in discovering a powerfully individual female speaker in the diverse documents that make up the novel Dracula, Bergeron imagines how a woman might record, write, and even type herself into being. Today, I'm going to demonstrate that Red offers a trans-inclusive feminist retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula by explaining how Bergeron transforms their source material. While queer theory is both more established and a much broader lens for approaching literary texts, in the last decade, scholars have begun advocating for a more specific approach to the creative outputs and lived experiences of transgender people. A journal titled Transgender Studies Quarterly was founded in 2014 in order to focus on transgender people as subjects rather than objects of knowledge. In other words, to explore what we can learn from transgender people rather than simply about them. This approach has informed work in many different disciplines and subfields, leading to, for example, a special issue of the journal Victorian Review on trans Victorians. Building on the earlier research on gender in Dracula that I mentioned in my review of relevant criticism, there has been at least one major article published in the last 5 years that specifically identifies Count Dracula as a trans body whose gender fluidity challenges the norms of English culture in Stoker's novel. Chase Bergeron's reimagining of Dracula in Red blurs the boundaries between characters, and therefore their categorization according to a gender binary, because the language of Red's singular female speaker is drawn from all the narrators that contribute to the original novel. Bergeron's erasure thus amplifies the physical and mental gender crossings already detectable in, for instance, Stoker's account of Lucy's 4 successive male blood donors and Mina's psychic access to the Count's sensation while traveling. However, Red identifies neither its narrator nor her predecessors, the women of Dracula named as Wilhelmina Murray, Lucy Westnara, and the Weird Sisters, as trans. Instead, Bergeron's assertion that the narrator traveled alongside them during their transition asks us to read this erasure of Dracula as always informed by a trans-feminist perspective. Transfeminism is an inclusive version of feminism that emphasizes both agency and embodiment in our gender identities and experiences. Transfeminism validates trans women as women, often by demonstrating that transgender women are more vulnerable to the sexual violence and misogyny that so often define women's historical and ongoing experiences of gender depression. Bergeron provides a perspective on being a woman within the world of Dracula from the point of view of someone previously excluded from and now emerging into the category of woman. Ironically, this very precarity also makes Bergeron's experience of womanhood even more central and definitional than that of a cisgender woman who is assigned that identity at birth. Critics interested in Bram Stoker as a potentially homosexual writer have argued that Dracula should be understood as providing a perspective from within the closet, specifically a terrified and titillated fantasy by the implications of being a heterosexual woman. Scholars such as Barry McCrae emphasize that if Stoker did occupy the marginalized identity of a man attracted to other men, and at that point in time, thus unable to participate in a publicly institutionalized relationship, Dracula might represent a woman's experience of heterosexual marriage as both alluring and frightening. In many ways, Chase Bergeron's transgender identity provides a parallel fear of and desire to become a woman. But as I have noted, their perspective on female experience is not additional or alternative, as a gay man's would be, but instead intensified and clarified. Berggrun's erasure of Dracula extends the traditional feminist critique of the novel that describes Lucy and Mina as survivors of abuse, whose self-proclaimed protectors are actually coercive and violent men. They are the real vampires in the novel, according to feminists. And indeed, vampirism has been a popular metaphor for women's reckoning with patriarchal authority since second-wave feminism was established in the 1960s. Sylvia Plath, for example, in a poem addressed to her father, described her husband as the vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, ultimately celebrating the stake driven into her father's fat black heart. So now we're going to examine Red more closely in order to see how the choices Berggrun made in erasing Dracula accomplished their stated goal, to create a narrative at odds with Stoker's hollow, easy, flawed hallucinations of women. For example, we can look at Berggrun's erasure of chapter 5 of the novel, the chapter in which we first encounter the voices of our central female characters, Mina and Lucy, through their exchange of letters. In the original text, Stoker presents Lucy as seeking her friend's endorsement for gender deference, stating, "A woman ought to tell her husband everything, don't you think so, dear?" And asking, "Dear Mina, why are men so noble when we women are so little worthy of them?" Berggrun starkly inverts Lucy's subservient rhetoric in their version, as the narrator appears to respond to such an appeal with the starkest of rebuttals, announcing that a woman ought to tell her husband very little, and finishing the poem with the unpunctuated, "Why are men so little worthy of a girl?" Berggrun has explicitly acknowledged the significant influence of Werner Herzog's 1979 film adaptation of Dracula, and its portrayal of Lucy as self-determined, powerful, a take on the novel that is part of the broader feminist trend in late 20th century adaptations. Berggrun's version of chapter 16 of Dracula is another example of their feminist reimagining of the novel. In the erased poem, Berggrun's narrator describes herself in the terms Dr. Seward uses for the vampiric Lucy, and then asserts, "I will strike the blow that sets me free. I shall be ready to find the author of this sorrow and stamp him out," taking on responsibility for the tasks assigned by Stoker to Lucy's band of admirers. Like Joss Whedon's Buffy, another inspiration for Berggrun, Red's narrator can slay for herself. Red builds upon feminist readings of Dracula, not only by reversing Stoker's monstrous depiction of Lucy, but also by acknowledging what has been seen as progressive in Mina's character by more recent feminist critics. It's common now to emphasize that the novel would not exist without Mina's abilities to document and circulate knowledge, abilities upon which the plot to kill Dracula predominantly relies. Berggrun has made it clear in interviews that they believe Stoker's misogyny is deep-seated, and thus to celebrate Mina's agency when reading the novel is our contribution rather than Stoker's intention, the result of our own authorial role and creative power as feminist critics, our skill in editing Dracula into the feminist text that Stoker was unwilling or unable to produce. There is a clear parallel between Mina, Stoker's feminist critics, Chase Berggrun, and the narrator of Red. All of them create their own agency and their own narratives from the resistant materials of the patriarchy. This is not only feminist, it is trans-feminist, because such an approach emphasizes the agency of people to identify and affirm their gender, as well as highlighting the significance of their embodiment and lived experience. The narrator of Red composes and articulates herself, fashioning her body as well as her speech. Let's explore that claim in more detail by turning back to the text and close reading an example, Berggrun's erasure of chapter 4. In the original novel, this is the final chapter in Jonathan Harker's journal of his experiences at Castle Dracula. It includes such provocative incidents for thinking through queer embodiment, performance, and identity as the Count undressing Jonathan, the Count posing as Jonathan after stealing his clothes, Jonathan mimicking the Count's lizard-like crawl across the castle walls, and Jonathan inflicting a gash on the blood-bloated Count's face, all of which have been explored in depth by critics interested in homoeroticism and gender instability. In Berggren's erasure of this chapter, the narrator has to pretend to obey her monster of a husband, as she, like Jonathan, occupies a prison in which her body is threatened. Rather than exploring this prison or investigating her captor, however, as Jonathan does, the narrator searches within herself and her body. Twice, she states, "I made a discovery." Such discoveries are of her suppressed emotions, as hate awakened and she unlocked despair. But the concrete language borrowed from Jonathan's investigation of a physical space is not merely transferred to describe abstract emotions. Instead, Berggren's narrator also insists on the physicality of her self-exploration. This is presented literally in a possible scene of autoeroticism. Her descent into a tunnel-like passage builds to a release as her body becomes a banquet, ever widening. Integrating psychological and embodied self-discovery, the narrator reclaims the sense of her identity, so forcibly splintered by her husband's abuse. This unearthed selfhood is not a stable and coherent center of identity, but a dynamic and complex act of recreation. A song sung by wheels and whips, a determined echo hammering away. In Dracula, Mina's acts of textual reproduction, as she transcribes and types, among others, her husband's shorthand and Dr. Seward's phonograph journals, are a collaborative act of service. In Red, such actions are transformed into a solitary narrative of self-determination. Having earlier come alone to learn about the history of women's destruction in a sort of library, the narrator later affirms her power to tell the other side through typing out her thoughts, her heart, and herself. Having copied the words of this terrible story, she can track and comprehend the unfolding narrative of her subjugation, and thus she can decide to author its ending by plotting her husband's death. She had earlier wanted him blotted out, but then realizes she must create his presence rather than realizes she must create his absence rather than erase his presence. I came to the conclusion that the best thing would be death. I had written the last hour of his life. Predicted and planned in chapter 17, Red ends 10 chapters later with the line, "And he died." Red bears witness to its narrator's experience of abuse, and her commitment to share bitter hours recorded here is essential to counter her husband's gaslighting. For instance, the narrator's unfolding realizations are indicated by the use of both spacing and line breaks in this example. "I've given up sleep. I'm getting fat," he tells me, "that he loves me, but I doubt that." Following her announcement of an intentional physical behavior, "I have given up sleep," the narrator's apparently self-deprecating perception of her body, "I'm getting fat," initially seems to emerge from her husband's representation of it, "He tells me." However, the subsequent line reveals that what he tells her is that he loves her, untrustworthy information about his own emotional attachment to his wife, which she questions after pausing only briefly. "But I doubt that." While alluding to a conventional insult from a man becoming bored of a female lover, the narrator's description of her enlarging body is reclaimed as potentially both accurate and worth celebrating. Aspiring to the vigilance enabled by wakefulness, the narrator is also gaining mass and taking up space, able to reject her husband's account not only of her appearance, but of his own feelings. These lines are a relatively close transcription of the flirtatious nonsense from Arthur that Lucy shares with Mina in the original novel, but contrast radically with Stoker's emphasis on both women's absolute trust in their partners. As Berggren recovers an alternative narrative from the male-authored text of Dracula, their narrator must do so similarly. The risk of requiring such an account from a survivor, however, is that their confession of trauma is expected to satisfy patriarchal scrutiny. The narrator of Red finds herself not in a condition to prove much after one instance of assault. She is hieroglyphical, half obliterated, like an ancient manuscript fragment that can only be partially deciphered. She fears what her body might reveal to the man who intends to autopsy, operate, cut, unscrew. Having recognized her entry into sexual maturity, both puberty and marriage, as a wound, she writes that my girl blood, my queer blood, seemed to keep breaking down, the secret of my body coming out. The description of her blood as both girl and queer suggests the extreme vulnerability of the trans feminine body, which often functions as a public site to negotiate social anxieties about gender and women, regardless of the private intentions and individual agency of those who live with and through such bodies. Think, for instance, how often transphobic legislation on sports and bathrooms is specifically trans-misogynistic, representing trans women's bodies as the ultimate threat. The narrator of Red recognizes that men who explain, have denounced female bodies as unholy when it is they who have enacted sacrilege upon them. Exposing the threat of masculine reason as it is exerted upon women's bodies, Red strives to create a parallel account of a woman's intellectual and embodied experiences that seeks legibility. While in Dracula, Jonathan Harker offers bare, meager facts verified by books and figures in his journal, Berggren's narrator in the erased version of Chapter 3 decides to begin with the embodied and individual observation Stoker's male protagonist explicitly dismisses as confusing and doubtful. The narrator of Red wants to believe in a universe willing to understand, acknowledging such a readership as both desirable and unlikely. She begs the reader for acknowledgement. Can you not tell? Don't you know? In the impatient hope that her attempt to narrate has succeeded as a communicative act. This whole story is put together in such a way that you know more than I do. And thus, the reader bears a significant responsibility to avoid a prurient attitude toward her disclosure or a hasty judgment upon her sanity. We must engage with the narrator's testimony and Berggren's erasure on their own terms, even as we recognize their goals are to be accomplished collaboratively. There is much more I could unpack, and indeed have done in other versions of this project to analyze Red, but I will stop there for now and trust we can always talk more individually later on. I will be concluding today's remarks by reflecting on how this specific research project suggests several larger possibilities for literary studies, as I want to make sure I address the "so what" question I always pose to students when I review their essays, and performatively wonder about the implications of their claims for their audience. Before I wrap up, however, I also wanted to draw the curtain back and share more information about both the context and the process for this research project. You may be asking yourselves how and why I began thinking about these texts in this way, as well as how I developed my argument and analysis. One important piece of background information about me that may explain why I would choose to focus on Bram Stoker's Dracula is that I am very interested in literary texts that create effects of voicing. Indeed, my doctoral thesis, the 80,000-word dissertation I completed to be awarded a PhD, was entitled Hearing Voices. In that dissertation, I focused on analyzing several texts that disperse lengthy narratives across many distinct voices, including Wilkie Collins's sensation novel, The Woman in White, and Robert Browning's epic poem, The Ring and the Book. I argued that these authors ask readers to exercise judgment amongst, to borrow a phrase from The Ring and the Book, voices we call evidence, voices that offer fragments of a narrative that readers must piece together. It was particularly important to my argument that such voices were always mediated, and sometimes even not human. Famously, Collins includes the narrative of the tombstone at the climax of his novel. Dracula is, of course, narrated by multiple characters, as Stoker constructs the novel through a diverse range of documents. Dracula foregrounds the various technologies, the typewriter and phonograph, letters and telegrams, diaries and newspapers, that mediate voices and bodies for us as readers. It would have been a wonderful case study for my dissertation. And so I was always hoping to have the opportunity to write about it one day. However, Dracula is an academic industry unto itself. It even has its own dedicated journal, the Journal of Dracula Studies, a peer-reviewed academic publication that has existed since 1999. I needed to find a fresh angle on the novel, a gap or niche in the already extensive scholarly conversation that I could occupy. And then, at a colleague's dissertation defense, another colleague of mine ended up recommending that I read Chase Berggren's Red. And as soon as I realized that Berggren had created a singular lyric speaker from the novel, because the cross-pollination between novels and poems is also a huge interest of mine and appears in the dissertation, well, I had a place to start thinking through Dracula in a way no one else had likely done before. Once I read Red, and yes, I'm pretty sure the title is an intentional pun, I also realized how much I could learn from it about gender and sexuality. I've often written about how gender and genre intersect, and I teach a course on LGBTQIA literature here at Hastings College. But Berggren's poems gave me the opportunity to learn much more about transgender studies and developed my previous understanding of feminist criticism toward the trans-feminist criticism I've been modeling for you today. I mentioned earlier that a colleague recommended that I read Chase Berggren's Red. So she is, of course, someone whose influence on this project I have to acknowledge. The poet and translator, Dr. Kerry Carnahan, who I worked with closely during our graduate studies. You may recall that Kerry and I were talking at the dissertation defense of another fellow graduate of the University of Connecticut, Dr. Alex Gatton. Alex then went on to read a draft of my conference paper on Red and make many useful suggestions, especially drawing on his own work on gender, sexuality, and form in the Romantic period and his own lived experience as a trans man. I remember us thinking through one particular poem while on the phone to each other, both reading into it our embodied experience of hormone therapy as I was undergoing fertility treatment at the time. I also have to thank the other reader of my draft paper, Dr. Sarah Berry, who has been my most consistent collaborator over the past decade. My goal here is not simply to thank those without whom this project, and indeed many other personal and professional achievements, would not have been possible, although such gratitude is of course crucial to express. I'm also trying to make a point about how important community is to scholars and researchers. Two other folks I have to thank are from our Hastings College community, Dr. Austin McDonald and a 2021 alumna, Courtney Hansen. Austin and I usually meet each week for an hour during the semester to write, while Courtney and I ran our own mini writing retreat last March while she was working on her senior thesis, coming together every morning at Blue Moon. I could go on. For example, my friend Jo Bear-Springer and her daughter brought me dinner one night in McCormick when I was working late on rereading Dracula. The reason for that particular food emergency was that I had a very specific and public deadline for the first iteration of this project. Almost a year ago, in October 2020, I applied and was accepted to the 19th Century Studies Association conference with a 500-word proposal about how red invites us to encounter Dracula in a new light. That meant I had to be ready to give a 15-minute presentation during my scheduled time slot at the conference to be held virtually this March. Academic conferences are usually organized by interest groups focused on a particular field within a larger discipline. In literary studies, these are often specialized according to region or time period, so that scholars interested in Midwestern American or medieval literature can gather together to listen to each other's current research and offer feedback. I took a very common step in using a conference to create accountability for myself, to establish a deadline and an audience for a project that I could then develop into a more substantial essay for publication. This is still my intention, and I've already made some progress on expanding and revising the conference presentation into a full-length article with a particular journal in mind. I've been motivated to continue working through this often lengthy process because of the opportunity that the faculty and students at Hastings College offered me to present my work in this forum. It's a great honor to be here today and to deliver an invited faculty lecture. I hope some of you are inspired to learn more about what I've been discussing, and handily, our librarians have created a relevant selection of resources for you to check out over in the Perkins Library. I'm grateful to you all for being my audience and would ask you to indulge me for a final few minutes now to reflect together on what other motivations there might be for pursuing research in literary studies. What exactly does this example of reading Dracula through the perspective of Chase Berggrun's Red reveal about how and why at least some of us in literary studies do what we do? Part of my answer to that question is firmly rooted in queer theory. The aspect of queer theory that has both long appealed to me and been extremely important for my work is how queer theorists challenge us to rethink time, history, and the relationship of the past to the present. This becomes obvious when we think about a course such as LGBTQIA literature. To collect a diverse range of texts from different historical moments under the umbrella LGBTQIA literature is, of course, an anachronism. It's important to examine how gender and sexuality have been constructed in different social contexts. And indeed, it can be liberating to explore alternative ways of understanding ourselves and our experiences beyond our own immediate cultural framework. For example, in the 1890s, when Dracula was published, one emerging way of understanding gender that Stoker was certainly familiar with was that all men and women have the cells of both sexes within them, and their behavior, including their sexual attraction, was determined by the proportions of each sex within an individual. On the other hand, the work of anachronism, of naming texts as queer, is also necessary for creating such a canon as LGBTQIA literature, and for uncovering a trans-historical community of writers who imagine, communicate, and realize the experiences of and possibilities for those with marginalized identities and bodies. Red is a perfect example of what the scholar Carolyn Dinshaw has described as touching across time. Berggrun provides through their erasure of Dracula the life-affirming self-recognition that queer reimaginings of older texts offer to queer readers who are otherwise so often denied historical visibility. Berggrun follows the example of generations of readers of Dracula who have discovered possibilities in the novel for thinking through experiences that may not have been understood or embraced by its author. Whether you believe such readings are imposed on the novel externally or arise from hidden depths within the text itself, or, perhaps most likely, some complex mixture of the two, literary studies gives us the tools and the time to create and discover such possibilities. I have tried to demonstrate today how literary texts from the past are not simply artifacts of their original moment, but have ongoing histories and lives in which we can all participate. Such texts survive not because they possess an inherent or universal value, but because they offer us something we can use, because we can continually remake them. Dracula is a very obvious example of a text that is always already proliferating. We cannot seem to escape its influence on our culture. What Chase Bergeron does in Red is to discover within it a contemporary voice, the voice of a survivor. And in doing so, this trans poet transforms Stoker's novel into a source of insight and agency into what it means to be a storm of a woman. Red invites us to think again about how we do gender with our bodies and our words. I offer you today what the collection has offered me, and hope that you too are grateful that the narrator's queer tongue could not shut up. Thank you.